The morning was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Nathaniel Rourke, a retired Special Forces sergeant in his late 60s, moved through the modest routines of his morning. Hot coffee in a chipped blue mug, the leash of his service dog Ranger coiled loosely in one hand, the other resting gently on his chest, where a folded letter from his son always remained, tucked close like a second heartbeat. The letter had never been opened. Nathaniel's small house, a single-story home shaded by a pair of tired oaks, sat at the corner of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where mailboxes rested in peace and neighbors nodded instead of spoke. He liked it that way. After years spent walking battlefields where every shadow was a question and every noise a threat, silence had become a sanctuary. Ranger, a brindled Belgian Malinois trained to detect oncoming panic attacks, was always near, always watching him with eyes that understood more than they should. Then came the flash. It wasn't light, not really. More like a disruption. A tearing of peace. Nathaniel had just turned the knob of his front door when the shout pierced the air. "Drop the weapon. Get on the ground now." He froze. The door was half open. Beyond it stood men in black, faceless behind helmets, their rifles aimed straight at him like they saw a ghost that needed killing. A ghost that looked exactly like him. The leash fell from his fingers. He didn't even have time to speak. The crackling pop of the taser was swallowed by the chaotic command of overlapping shouts. His knees buckled. The world tilted. Pain swallowed everything, muscle, thought, breath. As he crumpled onto his own porch, he saw a ranger leap toward him with a sharp bark, protective and confused, teeth bared not out of aggression but terror. Then, blackness. 6 minutes later, as his eyes fluttered open and the pain pulsed like a second tide beneath his skin, he heard it, the low, unmistakable growl of diesel engines. But not police cruisers. These were heavier, hungrier, the kind of sound you don't forget if you've heard it once. Ranger was at his side, trembling but loyal, nudging Nathaniel's cheek with a wet nose. Around them, the SWAT team was still moving, one man kicking through the front door, another barking orders into a radio clipped to his vest. Everything felt wrong, surreal, like the war had come home. It wasn't long before the military arrived. The National Guard didn't approach like the SWAT team had, they deployed. There was precision to them. Control. The soldiers fanned out across the block, cordoning off both Nathaniel's house and the nearly identical one next door, the actual target. A lieutenant colonel stepped out of the lead vehicle, but Nathaniel didn't need the uniform to know the man. Colonel James Alden, his former commanding officer. A man he had once saved from a burning convoy in Kandahar. Now it was Alden who knelt beside him. "Rourke. Nate, it's me. You all right?" Nathaniel blinked. His limbs ached. His throat was sandpaper. The red barbs from the taser still clung to his shirt like insect stingers. His voice came low, cracked. "They toss me for walking my dog." Alden's jaw flexed, eyes rising to take in the trashed home, the quivering dog, the broken porch light. Then they found the SWAT team leader, a man with a clipboard, sweating bullets now that he recognized the insignia on Alden's chest. "You hit the wrong house," Alden said, his voice steel wrapped in velvet. We had a warrant. That warrant was for 427 Timberline. This is 429. You couldn't read a mailbox." The air thickened. Even the birds seemed to stop. Alden stood, eyes cold now. "Get your men out. Now. Leave everything. This man is a decorated war veteran. And this is not justice." The SWAT officers retreated, humiliated and quiet. The National Guard remained, establishing calm not just with weapons but with competence. Ranger was checked by a military vet on site. Nathaniel was gently escorted inside. His house was cleaned by soldiers who had seen real war and knew what real damage looked like. And Colonel Alden stayed. "You all right?" he asked again, quieter this time. Nathaniel nodded, the folded letter still pressed close to his chest, its corners damp with sweat. His eyes didn't leave the dog curled beside him. They saw the leash and still fired. Alden didn't respond right away. When he did, his words were slow, deliberate. Then we make sure no one forgets this. Outside, the neighborhood watched. A few had filmed.
Some cried.
Others simply stood in awe, finally understanding the quiet man who walked his dog every morning without fail, the one who never talked much but always saluted the flag on his porch, the one who had never asked for attention, only peace. But peace had come with a cost. And now, in the pale light of a violated morning, it was a promise being written anew, in boots on the ground, in folded letters, and in the silent bond between a man and the dog who'd never let him fall alone. They said it was a mistake, a misread number, a glitch in the system. But to Nathaniel Rourke, what happened that morning was not a mistake. It was a memory reborn, different uniform, same violence. He had survived ambushes before, but this one had come wrapped in the colors of the very flag he fought for. Days blurred. Nights became slower, more viscous. Ranger lay at the foot of the bed, restless, as if the dog too had begun to dream in static and sirens. Nathaniel, once sharp and deliberate in every move, now hesitated, at doorknobs, at drawers, at the edge of sleep. Even the kitchen light felt too bright, as if exposing him. The apology came swiftly, predictably shallow. A typed letter from the precinct. No names, no signatures, just a printed header and a digital shrug. But what truly broke something deep inside Nathaniel came 2 days later. He had gone to the hardware store, small, local, where they knew his name, knew his limp. He was reaching for a box of wood screws when he heard the whisper. That's him, the guy they thought was a threat. He didn't turn. He didn't have to. The tone carried enough. The box dropped from his hand. Ranger, ever alert, nudged his thigh. He crouched to pick up the pieces, screws scattering like shrapnel across the tile, but in that moment, the aisle felt too long, the ceiling too low. His breath came quick, shallow. He could hear it again, the shouting, the taser, Ranger barking, the world exploding inward. He left without the screws. Back home, he didn't unpack the car. He sat in the driveway with the engine off, keys in hand, staring at nothing. His reflection in the rear view looked older than it had 2 days ago. Weary, fractured. A knock came at the window. He flinched, but it was only Alden. Colonel James Alden didn't wear his uniform anymore, but he carried the weight of it in every measured step. His hands were calloused like Nathaniel's. His eyes didn't flinch. And when he spoke, it was with the kind of voice that could still hold command or confession. "Can I come in?" Nathaniel nodded. They sat in the living room, blinds drawn, Ranger between them like a sentinel. Alden didn't waste time. "I read the after-action report. They said your hand was near your waistband, that you didn't respond fast enough. I was holding a leash." "I know." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, the kind that pressed into the skin. "I used to believe," Alden said, slowly, "that as long as we did the right thing, followed orders, stayed clean, the country would take care of us. But what happened to you, that wasn't a system mistake. That was someone deciding you looked like the kind of man who could be dangerous." Nathaniel exhaled, the sound bitter. "You ever wonder why we made it back?" Every night. Their eyes met, soldier to soldier, both carrying the same weight. Then Nathaniel spoke the words that had been rotting inside him since that morning. "I didn't even fight back." Alden didn't respond with comfort. He didn't say, "You didn't have to." He simply said, "I wouldn't have either." It wasn't absolution. It was shared guilt. Later that evening, Nathaniel opened the letter. The one from his son. It was dated a year ago. The handwriting was sharp, impatient, too much like his mother's.
"Dad,
you probably won't read this. Maybe that's why I'm writing it. But I wanted to say something before I head out. Afghanistan, again. I keep thinking maybe if I survive this tour, I'll understand why you always looked like the war never left you. But if I don't, then maybe you'll finally read this and know that I did it for something. For someone.
For you, Jay."
Nathaniel didn't cry. He just sat there, the letter in his lap, his hand resting on Ranger's head like a lifeline. The world outside turned gray, and for once, he didn't turn on the porch light. The house remained in shadows, not out of fear, out of clarity. The mistake they made wasn't the address. It was thinking a man like him would stay silent. And as the night stretched forward, a new weight settled into his spine. Not the burden of the past, but the shape of what came next. He had been mistaken for the enemy.
Now they would see who he really was.
They came not with sirens, but silence. No blaring horns. No unnecessary spectacle. Just a single black SUV rolling up the street like a thought too dangerous to speak aloud. Nathaniel Rourke watched from his porch, mug in hand, eyes shadowed by the brim of an old 3rd Battalion cap. He didn't move.
Didn't need to.
Ranger was already alert, ears perked, stance coiled, not hostile, but cautious. 3 men stepped out. They were plain clothes, but not plain. You could tell in the way they carried themselves, not law enforcement, not military, not federal in any visible sense, but professional, controlled. The kind of men who didn't need to raise their voices to command rooms or raise guns to kill. The man in front, mid-50s, silver in his temples, approached without pretense. He didn't offer a badge. He didn't apologize. He simply spoke with calm, cool gravity. "Mr. Rourke, my name is Morgan." A pause. "We've been watching what happened. We'd like to talk." Nathaniel said nothing. He sipped his coffee. Then, "About the wrong house? Or the right one next door?" Morgan's lips quirked slightly, not amusement. Respect. Both. Inside, the air seemed to change as the 4 men sat. The 2 who accompanied Morgan took up quiet corners of the room, saying nothing, scanning everything. Ranger stayed between them all, settled but alert, reading the room like his handler had taught him. Morgan leaned forward, hands clasped, elbows on knees. "Do you know who lived at 427 Timberline?" Nathaniel nodded once. "Family. 2 kids. Left in the middle of the night 2 months ago. Never saw them again." "They were being watched," Morgan said. "Not by us. Not by anyone with oversight. The man, Thomas Rell, was part of something old, forgotten by most. A project buried so deep it didn't exist in ink." Nathaniel's brow didn't furrow, but his silence sharpened. Morgan continued. "We think someone used your neighborhood, used proximity, to make Rell disappear. To make it look like just another procedural error. Meanwhile, the real operation, whatever it was scrubbed clean." Nathaniel's voice was a low grind of gravel. "And I got caught in the wash." "You weren't supposed to. That's the problem." Morgan's tone dipped. "You weren't just wrong place, wrong time. You were the wrong variable. You survived too much, remembered too well." A pause. Then Morgan added, almost gently, "And you didn't die quietly." There was no apology in his voice. No attempt to soothe. Just truth. Nathaniel stood, walked to the fireplace, and touched the folded letter from his son still resting in a tin box above the mantel. The house was clean now. Repaired. But some damage never left the bones of a structure.
Or a man. He turned.
"Why are you here?" Morgan didn't blink. "Because we don't trust what's coming next. And we think you might be the only person who's already lived through the kind of storm we're walking into." Silence thickened. But it wasn't empty. It vibrated with something unspoken, history, perhaps. Or dread. Then Morgan opened a case. Inside was a folder.
A name.
A symbol Nathaniel hadn't seen in 25 years. A black sigil with a vertical dagger and wings folded like silent prayers. The Ghost Recon Initiative.
Disbanded.
Buried.
Denied.
Nathaniel's mouth was a thin line now. That program was decommissioned. Morgan's eyes darkened. Parts of it were never meant to be. Parts of it still aren't. The room grew colder, not from weather, but from memory. Nathaniel felt the past stretching its fingers across his spine. Kabul, Ramadi, the Arctic perimeter, and now, a quiet American street where justice had worn the wrong uniform and knocked on the wrong door. He knew what Morgan was asking, even if the man hadn't said it outright. They didn't need a soldier. They needed a witness. A ghost with teeth. Someone who understood the code and the chaos underneath it. Nathaniel looked down at Ranger, whose gaze was steady, unwavering. I don't wear uniforms anymore, he said quietly. Morgan nodded once. That's why we came to you. Later that night, when the SUV disappeared into the black and the stars returned to their posts above the cul-de-sac, Nathaniel sat in the dark, the folder unopened beside him. He didn't need to read it to know what it contained. It wasn't about what had been done to him anymore. It was about what was being done in his name, in the shadow of the very systems he had once bled for. The real force had arrived, not in helicopters, not in tanks, but in truth.
Cold.
Clinical.
Precise.
And if they were right, the next mistake wouldn't be a misaddressed raid. It would be erasure. Justice doesn't rise like the sun. It doesn't announce itself with golden light or triumphal music. It comes like breath returning to a drowning man, slow, painful, raw. And when it rises, it's not always beautiful. Sometimes it wears scars. Sometimes it limps. But it moves forward nonetheless. Nathaniel Rourke had spent the last 3 nights not sleeping. Not because of nightmares. Those had long since become old friends, but because silence now felt loaded. Charged. The world outside his window was still, yet something was shifting. Like the quiet before a controlled detonation. Or a reckoning long overdue. Morgan had left the folder behind. It sat like a wound on his kitchen table, thick, creased, and humming with old ghosts. Inside were names, projects,
Coordinates.
all wrapped in language that had no place in a democracy. Assets, containment zones, expendables. They didn't call them people anymore. That was always the first clue. But the final page was what undid him. A photo, black and white, surveillance angle, blurry but unmistakable. The girl, the older one from the house next door, was still alive. And she wasn't alone. They were holding her, training her. No legal process. No foster system. Just a code string and a reference tag. Project Pinion, Tier 3 Candidate 041. That night, Nathaniel drove. He didn't tell Morgan. He didn't wait for clearance or backup. Justice, as he had learned, rarely waited for approval. He didn't bring weapons, not yet. Just questions. But his fists were clenched on the wheel the entire way. The coordinates led to an old logistics facility 40 miles east, once a storage depot, now repurposed under the umbrella of something called Thermodyne Initiative. A shell company inside a shell company, wrapped in black ink and quiet men. He entered the perimeter on foot. Old instincts returned like breath. Shadow hugging, step placement, pulse management. Ranger followed at his side, ghost silent, nose twitching. What they found inside wasn't horror, not immediately. It was order, clinical. Fluorescent lights humming above children seated at desks, being shown maps and patterns and questions far beyond their years. Surveillance cameras watched them. Drones tracked motion patterns. It was school, if school had been invented by people who had forgotten what humanity felt like. And in the far corner, behind a one-way mirror, she sat. Lena. Older. Paler. But alive. The look in her eyes, though, had changed. Not fear. Not confusion. Training. He backed away before they saw him. He didn't want confrontation. Not yet. He needed more. Proof. Patterns. The system had learned how to hide, but Nathaniel had spent a lifetime learning how to see. And he was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about Lena. This was about a larger mechanism. A domestic version of old Cold War experiments. Break the child. Rewrite the instinct. Insert obedience. And someone somewhere had authorized it. Morgan met him back at the cabin that night, silent as always. But his hands weren't empty this time. He brought names. Flight logs. Medical trials. A sealed document from a Senate subcommittee that had disappeared from public record in 2014. Nathaniel read every page. Then he lit a match and watched them burn. Not out of recklessness. Out of clarity. The system didn't need more secrets. It needed confrontation. It needed voices that couldn't be silenced anymore. So he started making calls. Old voices answered. One by one. Garrett, who ran logistics out of Spokane now but still remembered what happened in Mosul. Elijah, who had gone underground after leaking troop abuse footage in Kandahar. Sophia, whose code-breaking nearly collapsed an NSA blackroom before they labeled her schizophrenic. They were ghosts like him.
Misused.
Disavowed. But not done. And they were angry. Justice, Nathaniel realized, wasn't something you asked for. It was something you built, piece by piece, with people who refused to forget. The mission wasn't rescue. It was exposure. The mission wasn't vengeance. It was release. They didn't need to storm gates. They needed to pull back the curtain. Let the world see what had been done in its name. As dawn cracked through the trees, Nathaniel stood on his porch again, Ranger beside him. The sky was pale and bruised with morning light. And somewhere, in a sealed compound hidden from the world, a child sat learning how to forget who she used to be. But not for much longer. Because justice was rising now, not perfect, not clean, but righteous. And this time, it would not be denied. It wasn't quiet after the storm. It was hollow, like a battlefield after the shooting stops, where the silence feels less like peace and more like the pause between verdict and execution. Nathaniel stood on the edge of what used to be a secure government complex. Now, it was just fractured glass and the acrid scent of burnt circuitry. The children were gone. Extracted. Escorted. Rehumanized. But it wasn't over. It never really ended, not for men like him. Morgan was sitting on a crate nearby, half-shadowed, nursing the wound in his shoulder. The bullet hadn't killed him, just reminded him how close he'd always been to the line. Neither of them spoke. There was too much memory in the air, too much grief shaped like steel in their lungs. Ranger lay at Nathaniel's feet, ears twitching, eyes never still. They had exposed enough to shake the pillars. Enough names, dates, footage. But the system doesn't die from embarrassment. It adapts. It bleeds in the dark, quietly, then puts on a new face. That was the real war now, not just survival but remembering. Not just truth, but vigilance. 3 of the rescued children were speaking again. One had drawn a map, not of escape, but of training exercises. Another whispered names in her sleep. Not monsters. Not torturers. Teachers. Mentors. Their abusers had worn smiles and praised obedience. That was the depth of the wound, betrayal dressed as care. Nathaniel watched one girl, Alira, as she reached for sunlight on the hospital steps that morning. Her fingers trembled in it, like touching something holy.
She didn't speak.
But she felt, and that, he realized, was the first true victory. Not the collapse of a facility, but the return of sensation, the resurrection of childhood. Justice had struck the compound like thunder. Now came the slow dawn, a time for rebuilding, relearning. Not peace, but healing. He met Sophia again 2 nights later, in a motel room lit only by the flicker of a CRT monitor. She had decrypted the last archive. It wasn't just about experiments. It was policy. A contingency buried in a Cold War doctrine, activated after September 11th, kept alive through privatized defense think tanks. The line between national security and human experimentation had been rubbed so thin it no longer existed. The last name on the list wasn't a scientist. It was a senator, still serving, still passing legislation. Nathaniel stared at the screen. Not in rage, not anymore. Just certainty. If justice had risen, now it had to speak. "We go public," he said. Morgan shook his head. "They'll discredit. They'll smear. They'll kill again." "Maybe," Nathaniel answered. "But they won't erase us." He looked back, toward the sunrise out the window. For the first time in years, the light didn't feel like exposure. It felt like promise. The kind you make to ghosts, to children, to the parts of yourself you abandoned in a desert or a bunker or a basement interrogation room. He reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph, the one of Lena, taken just days before the raid. She had looked so much like her sister. But in this frame, she was smiling. Truly smiling. He whispered to it, not knowing why. "I didn't forget." Behind him, Morgan was dialing encrypted lines. Sophia was uploading files. Ranger raised his head toward the wind. The system had been wounded. But they weren't done yet. They were the dawn now, fractured, quiet, steady. And justice, real justice, was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a voice rising in the light. In the stillness that follows the storm, there is not silence, but memory. It settles into every crack of every wall still standing, into the threadbare coats of the survivors, into the eyes of the children whose screams now live only in dreams. Memory does not need to shout. It lingers. It watches. And sometimes it promises. Nathaniel kept walking. Through cities that had no statues for the fallen. Through towns where names like Ashridge, Unit Theta, and Rehabilitation Directive 7 meant nothing to the people sipping coffee on their porches. He wasn't looking for confrontation. Not anymore. What he sought was something quieter and infinitely harder. Accountability without spectacle, justice without vengeance. He met with one of the children, Michael, now 17, taller, more reserved. His laughter came in sharp, unnatural bursts, like someone testing a language they no longer spoke fluently. He had started painting again. That was how he remembered. Every canvas was a confession, but not of his sins. Of the world's. This was where they told us we were chosen, he said, gesturing to a canvas soaked in grays and sick blues. But chosen for what? To be broken beautifully. Nathaniel didn't answer. He only stood beside the boy-turned-man and let the silence speak. Sophia had taken another route. Underground. Strategically leaking the documents, not all at once, but drip by drip. Each file, each testimony, each internal email a scalpel across the armor of the powerful. The senator resigned. 2 of the doctors faced trial. 3 more vanished. No one called it victory. They knew better. Morgan was gone. He had left a letter. No goodbye, just names, coordinates, a burner phone, and at the bottom, the words, "If the promise still matters, find me." Nathaniel would. Because they had made a promise. Not to the government. Not even to the dead. But to the children, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't. A promise not to let the world forget what people in suits and titles had done in the name of protection. They had carved that promise into bone. It bled with every breath they took. He returned to Illyria one evening. She was planting trees now, somewhere near the north border, quiet land, cold air. Her speech had returned in fragments. Not always connected. Not always linear. But when she looked at him and whispered, "You kept your word," he almost broke. Because there was still so much left to do. The memory of Lena stayed with him most nights. The photo. The last transmission. The way her voice had cracked when she realized the extraction was for others, not for her. That moment, raw, cruel, irreversible, lived inside him like a second pulse. It pushed him forward. Not with rage. With devotion. They weren't chasing headlines. They were planting truth like seeds, slow, deliberate, under the soil of apathy and distraction. They knew the system would regrow. But so would they. So would the survivors. He visited the memorial on what would have been her 21st birthday. There were no candles. No plaques. Just a grove of young trees. One for each child rescued. Illyria had named them herself. They bore no numbers. Only names. He stood among them, closed his eyes, and spoke to the wind. We are not heroes. We are not martyrs. We are the ones who remember. And we promised that what was done in the dark would be brought to light. Then he turned and walked away. Not because it was over, but because it had just begun. And the promise of those who do not forget is that they will never stop watching.